Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the wooden cabin that Le Corbusier designed in 1951 in Roquebrune, Cap Martin. Like many of Le Corbusier's works, it's full of contradictions. It's a shack, but Le Corbusier was also able to make claims about it as architecture. It's determined by its site, but also conceived as a movable prototype. I'm going to explain all these things later on. It was prefabricated, but it bears the marks of hand production. Here's the 2D elsewhere. Writing about the simple fishermen's shacks in the pine forests flanking the Bassin d'Arcachon near Bordeaux in France, where Le Corbusier and his wife Yvonne frequently took their holidays between 1926 and 1936, Le Corbusier wrote, and this is a sketch actually done by his friend Ozenfort of one of these fishermen's shacks. Le Corbusier wrote, "Here is the primitive house. This is where man defines himself, a creator of geometry. He could not act without geometry. He is precise." And then later on, in geometry, the organization empowers nobility and beauty. Will not this hut be one day the Roman pantheon dedicated to the gods? This statement, coming at the end of a long description, indicates clearly that Le Corbusier was thinking of Vitruvius's primitive hut. According to Vitruvius, the Roman writer Vitruvius, all architecture began originally with simple shelters made out of trees, where the wooden construction was slowly improved upon over the years and then imitated in the form of the Doric temple. So this is a founding story of the Western tradition of architecture, which is that all architecture begins with a hut. In his notes for a lecture in October 1929 in Buenos Aires, he recalled a sketch made in 1911, that's the sketch there, in Delphi, in Greece, of 3 stone plinths on the processional route. He says, "At Delphi," and I'm translating, "at Delphi, in a site of the great spiritual mysteries, these 3 stone dies provide all the force of architecture. They are alone and small in the face of the immense landscape, but they are just right. Their form is precise, in a startling rapport with all this nature. This is architecture." Okay. And this is what had stunned him about the Parthenon on the Acropolis when he visited also in 1911. And he coined the slogan, "An interior is always an exterior." And this is one of the sketches, one of his lecture notes, where he shows how one of his prototype houses, reproduced in different landscapes, becomes different. It's the landscape makes the architecture. And this is how he described the site of the Cabanon. We're going to come back to the Cabanon, but this is the site of the Cabanon in a letter that he wrote to his friend and erstwhile lover, Marguerite Chada Harris. She was a millionairess who, in later life, at this time, we're now in 1954, had set up a religious foundation. And he is trying to persuade her, successfully, to invest in some architecture on the site of Roquebrune. And this is how he describes the site. The Cabanon is there. This, on the bottom, is the plan of this little hut, which is where he actually worked. In Richard Pear's marvellous photograph here, we can see not only the view towards Monaco, where Yvonne was born, but also the trompe-l'œil effect, by which Le Corbusier turned his little square windows into fenêtres en longueur. I don't know whether you've worked out the trompe-l'œil here, but all this is reflection. So the same thing seen from the other side is like this. On the other side, by the bedhead, and you can see it in the distance there, is a horizontal window just by the bed, where the bed was, which just looks out on the stone wall of the terrace. It's a window designed for that person in that place to look out at that particular place, you would say. And then on the other side there's a window which looks towards the carob tree under which Le Corbusier worked in the hot summer months when it was too hot to work in his builder's hut. So I said at the beginning that this is something which is, I've tried to suggest to you there that this is a design which is based on the very particular relationship to the site, to the views from the bed, from the different places, towards the sea, towards his carob tree, and yet this was also a standardized plan. This, with a double bed, was actually not the cabanon. Otherwise, the plan is exactly the same as the cabanon, but it's actually a double bed and a child's bed on top of a cupboard, on top of a low cupboard here. This was actually a standard plan that he wanted to introduce in another housing scheme, and we'll come to that later on. One of his definitions of architecture is le dehors est toujours en dedans. The outside is always an inside. A dwelling is made by the view, made by the landscape. And in one of his lectures in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, he starts, this is a drawing that he's doing in front of the audience as he's talking. He starts with a sketch, very recognizable sketch, of the Sugarloaf Mountain of Rio. He then draws around it a frame and then turns it into the apartment. The dwelling is the landscape. That is the architectural sensation. In another sense, I suggested to you that at the beginning one of the contradictions is the difference between the idea of the particular and the universal. One of the common links, one of the explanations, is geometry. This is a photograph from the Dutch journal Vendingen, which Le Corbusier had in 1924, I think. And he wrote to the editor and said that he wanted the original photographs of these shells. He said he'd always collected shells, and he was fascinated by their geometry. And out of that came the Modulor, which is his system of harmonic numbers and dimensions. So the two scales, the blue and the red scale here, were a set of dimensions that fixed all the dimensions from very small up to very large, according to two harmonic ratios. The whole principle of the cabanon is that it's designed around the Modulor. Le Corbusier says, I sketched this out on a table napkin, and it was all done exactly as I designed it because I had the Modulor. I didn't have to measure anything or work anything out, I had the Modulor. Which, as always, is never quite true. As you can see, if you look at some of the drawings by his assistants, where they're desperately struggling to get the dimensions to come out to the Modulor. Things never quite work out. Dimensions in architecture are always subtraction or addition to something. So here they're desperately trying to get it so that it turns out that it's like the Modulor. So a slight shift of gear now. So I just thought I'd just show you some images of places where Le Corbusier lived and made small adaptations. In 1911, he spent the winter in a vernacular house at La Chaux-de-Fonds, snowbound for 4 months, which he kept exactly as it was, except that he added this window, this big window. Le Corbusier, all his life, however busy he was, and he was extremely busy for most of his career, always took a month, at least 1 month vacation, and always, or nearly always, by the sea. And through the 20s, this was at Le Piquet, on the Atlantic coast near Bordeaux, the Bassin d'Arcachon. And the first few years that he stayed there, it was in this house here. Later on, he stayed in another hotel. And there's Corbusier, there's Yvonne, who had not yet married, but he was about to marry. This is the kind of place that they liked to stay in. Then the house he designed for his mother, designed entirely around a long window looking out over Lake Geneva. Again, it's the view which makes the house. So these are kinds of different ways in which Le Corbusier designed for himself or for his nearest and dearest. And this is his own apartment where he lived between 1917 and 1933, and he had himself photographed by Brassai, the famous French photographer, or Hungarian photographer, which he published eventually in his book La Ville Radieuse. So this is very much an autobiographical photograph. This is how he wanted to be seen. And the text underneath says, when the door closes. Well, around the same time, a little bit earlier, 1928, I think, it's always described as 1929, but I think it's 1928, he did a little sketch, which he reproduced later on, called Ma Maison, My House, if I took it upon myself to become a property owner. And it shows a house in two quite separate structures. A studio with 4 vaulted shed roofs which capture the light and diffuse it down through the shell of the vault, and then a dwelling unit which is completely separate and attached by a kind of corridor of some kind. And this is what he designed for himself in the penthouse suite in the Rue Nungesser. He invested very heavily, and actually, as it happens, disastrously, in an apartment block which he designed and built. And he built for himself the penthouse suite. And it divides in exactly the same way. There's a studio with vaulted roofs and skylight windows, clerestory windows. And then at the other end, there's the dining area. It still has vaults, but with different kind of lighting. And in between is a corridor, which was the living room. Okay. So this is this kind of hierarchy of the dwelling components. So next to his studio was a little workspace where he had his telephone, his pigeonholes. The windows on this side overlooked a sports stadium, and for Le Corbusier, an essential ingredient of housing is that there should be a sports field at the foot of the apartment so that everybody could play sport. There's a staircase, an absolutely beautiful staircase leading up to the guest room and the terrace. This is his little living area with its own little skylight and the banquette. The table is by Charlotte Perriand a little bit later. And this is the view towards the dining room. Notice that he's already beginning to put alcoves into the wall to put objects. Now, one of the problems with the 1920s villas is there was nowhere to put objects. And in the photographs of the 1920s villas, the only objects you see are the odd flowers or his hat or spectacles or whatever. But by now, he was recognizing the need to put things. And we'll see there's a little bit in the film where you can see, but these alcoves had shells, objects, small sculptures in them. This is Yvonne's domain, the kitchen. Le Corbusier was an unreconstructed male. And beautifully designed by Charlotte Perriand with cupboards, ventilated, beautifully handmade, and a zinc, which anybody knows from Paris. This has all been redone. When I saw this first, the lead from this, the lead zinc, was bubbling up all over because it had been completely ignored for a long time. But this is like in a Paris bar, which has the countertop which goes straight into the sink and so forth. All hand done glass bricks. This is their bedroom next to the dining room with the shocking bidet next to a small wall where Le Corbusier hung a painting by Léger, just here right next to the bidet. And there's a his and hers bathroom. That's Yvonne's bathroom there, with a very small tub. There's the door is also a cupboard with a secret compartment at the back for Yvonne's jewels and other things. And this is Le Corbusier's end, next to the bed, where there's a shower, and there's an absolutely beautiful and fundamentally pure basin with Nevada glass tiles next to it. Going up the staircase to the terrace, roof terrace, which Le Corbusier rediscovered after the war, having had to leave Paris during the war for 4 years. Discovered it overgrown with plants and bushes, some of them 6 feet high, which had been brought by the birds. And from that moment on, he forbade any gardening in this roof terrace. And he wrote to a Dutch horticulturist, in fact, to ask for advice on what plants, what flowers might survive in completely untouched land, where there was no weeding, no turning of the soil of any kind, no enrichment. But the Dutch horticulturist didn't reply. And this is where I want to show the film. He bought a film camera, 16mm film camera, in 1936, and took a certain number of pieces of film. This is a bit that I've edited together about the... right, let's just watch it. He had exceptionally bad technique. So I've mixed in some... He also took still photographs with it, so I've mixed in some still photographs. So this shows the garden when it was still being lovingly tended by Yvonne. And this is him looking out over the landscape. And sports at the foot of the apartment. This is the dog looking out. This is Pinceau II. Pinceau I died tragically in 1935. This is niches with objects, Lipschitz sculpture. This is his atelier. This is Yvonne, who didn't like being filmed. And there's one sequence of film which is difficult to show because it's 12 frames long. That's about 3/4 of a second. It's half a second. But it's so beautiful that I reconstructed it. Where he's caught this relationship between Yvonne's face and the Léger painting. This is his mother who visited in 1936. In April 1938, just back from Algeria, he visited his friend Jean Badovici in the house which Eileen Gray had designed for Badovici between 1926 and 1929. Eileen Gray was no longer living in the house, unable to put up with Badovici's infidelities. And Corbusier stayed there for a month, and while he was there, he painted the first 2 of 7 frescoes on the walls of the house. This is a reconstruction of the house which is just happening at the moment, a restoration of the house, and all this is something, the colouring, based on the style colouring, has been discovered in the archaeology of scratching the paint on the wall and so forth, but it seems to only have existed for a few months. By the time the house was illustrated in 1929, all this had been painted over in either white or a light cream colour. But in the restoration it's been done like that. But the point about this visit was that Le Corbusier saw the view. This is the view towards Monaco, and this house is next to where he's going to build his cabanon after the war. He took some photographs with his camera, with his movie camera. There's Yvonne sitting in the Eileen Gray house with all the Eileen Gray furniture still in place. This is another of the frescoes. This I think is the best of them actually, which was done the next year in 1939. And there's Corbusier painting another of them, which doesn't exist anymore. So in 1949, after the war, Le Corbusier and his friend José Louis Sert and a total of 20 people, 20 draftsmen, had to find somewhere to work together on the plan for Bogota. And coming back from Dubrovnik, this seemed to be a good site. And while they were there, they discovered that just on the next door site, this man, Thomas Rebutato, who was a plumber from Nice, but had ideas, had decided to build a fish restaurant. And this is the view from the fish restaurant down some rocks to the sea. This is the terrace. Almost straight away, Le Corbusier becomes friends with Rebutato, and they begin hatching up schemes together. This was a project called Rock, for Roquebrune, which would have been a number of houses, holiday houses, on the slopes of behind the house going up towards the castle. And it was a site which Thomas Rebutato found for Le Corbusier. And there's a whole architectural history of rock, which I won't go into. It went through various stages and so forth. But there was another project, and this was all in 1949 already, to build some houses underneath the fish restaurant, right down onto the sea, on the rocks, which I just showed you. This is the first version of it. It was called Rob, for Robert. While waiting for Rob to be constructed, and there were lots of problems, Le Corbusier said, well, look, I want to come down here every summer. I don't want to stay in a hotel. I want to construct a shack where we can stay. So this was described as a project in 1951, which was a present for Yvonne, okay, to design something which would just tack on to the side of the fish restaurant. It was built by Charles Barbaris, who was a Corsican carpenter, but he was a carpenter who made industrial carpentry. He'd worked on the Unité d'Habitation. Barbaris manufactured the whole thing in Corsica. It was shipped by sea and then by train and delivered. The panels were delivered off the train, not at the station, but actually at the Cabanon site, and carried down by hand from the railway line by special dispensation and assembled. And it was only at the last minute in construction that this finish of rough wooden logs was decided on. Originally, Prouvé was meant to have been involved, and he would have done metal windows and special fittings for the ventilation slots, and the facade would actually have been in aluminium sheet. But Prouvé didn't sort of get it together in time, and so there was nothing, there was just the plywood panels, and they decided on this finish, literally in construction. So you enter at the bottom left through a very narrow corridor, 70 centimetres. Forget the door on the left for the minute, because that wasn't there to start with. And then you come in, you turn right into the house, and from from here to here is 3 meters 66, which is the modular figure, and that's a 366 square there. The 70 centimeters for the corridor and for the WC are added on, if you like. It's an addition to the geometry. And the height is 226 centimeters, 2 meters 26. So these are modular proportions. So you come into the space. There's a raised bed, which is number 7, which has drawers underneath for storage. And then on the plans there's always marked a bed where it says number 9, but actually Robert Reportage says that he remembers that Le Corbusier slept on the floor when Yvonne was there. There wasn't actually a second bed. Then there's a wash basin here with a simple plywood partition, and then a work table, and these are the windows that we've already seen. This is Bruno Cambreto's analysis showing the development of the plan, and he draws attention to the way that the panels in the ceiling, which are coloured, are in a pinwheel form around a central square. Okay, so the idea is that it rotates. Cupboard of the kind that Charles Perriand had originally designed. And the kind of thing which is unusual in the dwelling, there's Yvonne's bed, that's her head, and that's the toilet. Also, very important, ventilation. There's a ventilation slot. Corbusier by this time had separated the functions of the window. So ventilation was separated from illumination. So the aérateurs were vertical slots with mosquito netting on them, wire, mesh, which could be kept open all the time, and which allowed ventilation through from opposite diagonal corners. So from here in the WC, and then diagonally across the other side where the wash basin is. Very good, intensive use of storage, every conceivable space used for storage. Everything is very carefully sort of designed around daily use. So we've already seen how these folding shutters could be used with mirrors on the inside to expand the effect of the window. Well, at night when they closed, they provided the comfort of a painting. Every detail in this space is built around the experience of living there and added to over time. And as in the apartment at Nungesser, there's a separation of functions. So the cabanon was really for sleeping and for reading and for, if it rained you could stay there, but basically most of the time he'd be outdoors, and when he worked, if it wasn't too hot, he would work in this hut. And this was just an off-the-peg builder's hut that Thomas Rebutato constructed for Le Corbusier on 2 railway sleepers. The entrance to the cabanon is through this very narrow 70 centimetre corridor, which is one of the great problems about visiting the cabanon, is that basically you have to scratch your way past a Corbusier listed painting to get into the cabanon. And Le Corbusier very quickly discovered that if it rained, he couldn't get into the restaurant without getting wet. He just cut a door in the side of this corridor, which comes out in the bedroom of Thomas Rebutato. So this is the bedroom of the Rebutatos, and to cheer them up, he painted this painting, which has their dog in it. So this is now not a bedroom anymore because Robert Rebutato and Magda have actually built their own bedroom hidden out of sight further down one of the terraces. And an ingenious detail is that once again in the jamb of this door, which is thick because it's the full width of the partition, is a secret little cupboard for Yvonne's jewels. This is the side of the fish restaurant, the Étoile de Mer, facing the terrace, which is just a kind of list of the intimacy between these 2 men. This, for example, is a stylized version of one of the pebbles to be found on the beach, which had these curious lines on them, and which Le Corbusier had used in a number of his paintings, and even a sculpture. He found the shape of the head in one of these pebbles. In his fresco in Eileen Gray House, he also had a big version of one of these pebbles. This painting, which is a kind of mythology of the site. This is Thomas Rebutato on the left, and Saint-André des Oursins, the man who brought the sea urchins, who was a character. When Le Corbusier draws nudes and sea landscape, it's the same thing. So this is the kind of spirit of the Mediterranean here. And then here there's Rebutato's foot and Corbusier's foot. So it's a kind of, it really is a documentation of Le Corbusier's intimate relationship with the place and with the people. And he had himself photographed by Lucien Hervé, his photographer, kind of at ease in this site. This is a funny episode, a follow-on, which is that Charles Barberis, the carpenter, got in touch with an architect who they met at the Unité d'Habitation at Marseille, and they actually produced a version of the cabanon with a very similar plan, which was exhibited in Nice in 1958, and which was actually, some copies of it were sold. So Le Corbusier's wish almost came true. And I'm going to finish with another sort of epilogue, which is the last incarnation of Rob, where these camping houses on the rocks below the fish restaurant. So you can see the fish restaurant there with its arcade, the cabanon next to it, the carob tree, and the sea down here, and these houses. And there are many versions of these, but in one of them, to me the most interesting, the cabanon is used as a unit. This plan is exactly the plan of the cabanon, including the door which goes through to the Rebutato bedroom, used to go into a sort of communal area in the middle. So there are 2 cabanons back to back with a communal dining area in the middle. This is one of the versions of the camping. You can see it here. And you can see that in this version, which is close to the final version, the cabanon is there, and you can see in the elevations that it's actually a completely separate. If you look up there, it's a separate building inside the building. It has a roof. It's a hut within a hut. And this is one of a number of sketches that he made when he was trying to persuade Marguerite Charter Harris to invest in the project. This is actually this bit here was land that Le Corbusier actually bought in order to do Rob. So that the site of the Cabanon, next to the fish restaurant there, and then the whole of this land, Corbusier actually bought it. So this is one of the sketches he did for Margaret Charter Harris, and the number of postcards that he sent her marked up with indications of the site. Ici, notre terrain, Monte Carlo, and then here with a casino, and she might want to go to the casino. And then the old town of Roquebrune, picturesque old town, you have to climb up to the old town. And this, the Passion, that took place once a year. And here is little sketches, one for each of the 5 houses, showing the view. Again, the dwelling is defined by the view. So this is Maison 1, house 1. And here, Notre Rocher, our rock. Okay. This beautiful idea failed because in February 1955, Le Corbusier was actually on the site. The contracts with Margaret Charter Harris's signature on it to go ahead had been exchanged. It was all about to go ahead, and there was a freak storm, and waves came sideways over the site, right up to the level of the Cabanon, right next to the Cabanon, as far as the carob tree, and would have destroyed these houses. And so he renounced the project, but it very, very nearly happened. What finally did happen to replace Rob were these unités de camping, and they're actually rather beautiful. I mean, they're very cheaply made, but they're very a wonderful test of the existence minimum dwelling. We've stayed in them a couple of times, and they're very nice. They've got little steps here. They're built over the old pétanque, the bowls, French bowls, pitch, and they're extremely simple. Again, a simple version of the shutter, the simplest possible fastenings. And this is the end wall showing the Modulor, and then showing the substructure, which is basically storage, but which underneath is also where, underneath again, the next restaurant down is where there's a shower block. The key way to describe, this is the paradox, the key way to describe the architectural quality of the Cabanon is that it wasn't architecture but living. It was the humanity of this space of the fish restaurant. This is Thomas Robutato's son, the friendship with people who we met every year. This was what the Cabanon was about. Thank you.